Robert Allison is a digital artist from London, now living in Lisbon. His work focuses on the generative, using computation to create unique experiences, exploring the potential of the purely computational and the mechanistic, as this approaches the boundary with the natural, the tactile, and the real. In this conversation, we explore Robert's work, the limits and the potential of creative software.
My background is slightly interesting. My father's an architect. My mother is a more mathematical side. So I kind of imagine that I somehow combine those two sides. So I love design, and I love mathematics. I appreciate the aesthetics in both those things, and indeed I don't see them as different necessarily. It's the same sort of joy of the universe we live in, I guess. So I sort of tried to or been inspired by both those things in the sort of works I've been doing. I'm trying to think now how did this all come about? It came about. I was experimenting with working with color and representing color, or not representing color exactly, but a color generation process, and as part of that process. And what I was finding is that in trying to sort of explore this process, or experiments really, these experiments we're doing, I was actually producing some very interesting imagery, and so there was something going on here. And I explored some more and more into that, and again, just mainly producing still images, this sort of thing. Now then, I did have an opportunity to live and work in California for a few years, which of course is the mecca for tech arts. Let's say it's called tech art. I think that's the good understanding what it is. So of course I was there in San Francisco, and I met a lot of great people out there, got involved in some projects, and sort of got more interested in producing animations, generative animations. So moving on from the still images to more animated things. And of course, the great thing about creating a process that creates the images is that process can run in real time, so that you can generate an animation in real time. And more than that, you can actually take interaction from other people and feed that into the generation process. So, in fact, a lot of what I got involved with in San Francisco was it was a dance art collective called Kinetech Arts, and they're very much about interaction and art and projections and how that all sort of comes together. So now I'm in Lisbon. And I'm still very much interested in the generative animation side. I'm perhaps getting more and more abstract in what I'm trying to do, so less focus on sort of perhaps generating color, but more structure, and particularly with the work we've been talking about. This is a generative animation based on a cellular automata. And so it's almost the simplest possible generation algorithm you can think of. But because it works on a grid or a sort of two-dimensional plane, it can be three-dimensional, it can be of any configuration. It's curious how complexity and interest emerges from that. And particularly in this sort of creation of texture, almost materiality, I'm thinking. So there's something going on there. There's a connection between the sort of like simple processes, but because you're able to iterate them repeatedly at such scale, then things start to emerge that you might not necessarily expect from that original process. I kind of like to compare it almost to the real world, in the sense that the laws of physics are actually pretty simple, But there's so much richness and complexity in the world around us, and it's because they're sort of repeated and iterated and work together. It becomes this extraordinary whole. So perhaps in some ways I'm trying to reflect on that or have some echo of that in what I'm trying to do with the works.
This idea of emergence is always kind of hard to define, right? Where do you see that boundary in your work? The moment is there a moment where it stops being simple and it becomes something complex?
Absolutely, and that's the point where unexpected things happen. You know, when something I didn't think was going to happen happens. If you see what I mean. At that point, I know I've crossed some sort of boundary because it's no longer about me deciding what it is going to be. It's now me creating something which then goes on to create something else, and something comes out of that totally unexpected. And so it instead of a process, it stops being about definition, defining something, becomes more about exploring. Because then you see, okay, so you see there's something going on, you seize on it, and you sort of turn the dials and knobs and switches or whatever to and see where it takes you, and yeah, it is exploration. You're sort of uncovering things that you didn't know about before, that weren't there before. Well, they were there before, but you didn't know about them, right? So, and that really gives the inspiration and the drive to sort of keep doing this. If those things weren't happening, if what was coming out was just a reflection of what I put in, then it would be almost pointless, if you see what I mean.
Do you feel that there's some kind of like collaboration going on between you and the code and this kind of like
absolutely, yes. It's definitely a feedback loop. So I might have an idea of where I want to get to, but then often something unexpected happens on that process, and then I kind of veer off to a different direction. Or even I have no idea where I want to get to, but I think this might be worth experimenting with, or there might be something interesting going on there. So yeah, that's
cool. So yeah, thinking about this parallel with biology, you in your text and in your work you speak about von Neumann and
yes,
his architecture. First, I want to ask, like, if you look at, for example, the 20th century or even before, do you have a favorite period in the history of computing that you go back for references? Or?
Right, yes. And not just computing, but like art in general and architecture. The sort of the early 20th century was a quite extraordinary period in art, in architecture, in science. It was the birth of computing at that point. So that was a very exciting period. That's where the foundations were laid, I think. But then there's also the period in the sort of 60s and 70s, the counterculture and the birth of Silicon Valley and all these things. So that's another exciting period. So that's what I mean. For me, I like things that are simple and intuitive. Nowadays, so much is because we've moved things on so much, and a lot of the more simple and intuitive things have already been discovered or developed. So now it's about refinement and those kinds of things, which is, of course is great, but it must have been amazing back in those early days when everything was new and new discoveries were being made and new ways of thinking. I say in mathematics, in physics, in art, in architecture, all these things. The sort of the first half of the 20th century was an extraordinary period.
Thinking about this century and kind of these parallel, I don't know if they're parallel, but thinking that on the one hand, all these innovations in software, namely digital assistants on our smartphones and stuff, and then on the other side, stuff like AlphaFold and DeepMind and what they're doing with machine learning. How do you see this developing? And do you see any parallels between the two trends? How does that affect your work and your thinking?
Yes, I think what's interesting about what's happening now, or where we are now, is that it's become so much more social, if you see what I mean. So everyone can participate. And now, where that takes us exactly, it's not clear, you know. And certainly there are the downsides to that. Of course, the whole sort of fake news nonsense and these kinds of things, and the problems that social media has caused with trying to combat sort of false perspectives, etc., etc., etc. Those things, but. I think yes, this notion that everyone can participate, or we're all connected, that is part of a big the network effect of things. That's something that's emerging from our advances in technology. So it's like before we had the technology, now we're connecting the technology together, and of course that involves people. So it's now very much people and technology, and human beings are tool users, and these are new tools that we have, and particularly allow us to communicate and express to each other. And then how that will change society, is changing society, and what will happen next. So maybe some of the stuff that I'm doing, given that it's based on interactions between discrete entities or separate cells that perhaps on their own are fairly simple. I'm not saying that people are simple, but but it's the interaction between these things that something emerges from that. So I'll just turn this off. Sorry.
Speaking of interaction,
yes, exactly. It's absurd, isn't it?
Do you think that these projects, something like what DeepMind is doing, or these assistants, do you still look at them as mere tools? These systems capable of so-called deep learning and
right, yes, artificial intelligence, yes. Okay, so I have thoughts on this. Now, my feeling is, I'm just going to get a bit sort of theoretical here, but in mathematics, it was discovered there was a difference between different kinds of infinity. So we had, and in fact it's George Cantor, who realized this and proved that there was what we might call countable infinity, which is the infinity of the natural numbers, the counting numbers, the infinity of discrete things, separate objects. You can have 1, 2, 3, 4, infinity of them. And for a long while, everyone thought that infinity was the biggest infinity you could have. But he showed that that's not actually the case, and that, for example, the what we call the real numbers, the sort of 0.00567, etc., 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 pi, and these things, they actually live on or within a set of greater numbers, which is actually larger than our original infinity. Not only is it larger, it's incomprehensibly larger. It's so much bigger. And that it is within that infinity, the larger infinity, that the natural world lives. So down to the quantum level, perhaps it becomes a bit more discrete, but even then, it's probably etc. etc. But at our level, you need natural numbers. You need real numbers to describe this world. Whereas a computer is digital. It's just ones and zeros. So the state of any computer can be described with a very large number, but a discrete number, a natural number, a number that lives in this first infinity, this small infinity, shall we say. So my feeling is that it's intelligence, like real intelligence, you know what I mean, and possibly even the soul and these things, actually exist in this higher infinity. And that we can make a computer as big as we like, but because it's still in that smaller infinity, it will never have this general intelligence, this soul. So that's my feeling. So there's a lot of press, of course, about the DeepMind, about self-driving cars, all these things. And until we make a brain that lives on this real number plane, that in the real world, then we can't get across that barrier. And And by the time we've done that, we might as well grow a real brain, right? Because that's what it is. But I mean, if you look at a real brain, yes, it has neurons that fire at each other, but there's the timing is important, how connected they are is important, and there's so many of them, this kind of thing. So that's my feeling on that. So I feel that we don't have to worry about, or we shouldn't worry about artificial intelligence taking over our creative thoughts, for example, or these things. I think artificial intelligence will be a great tool, a great support for us, but as it's presently conceived, I don't think it's going to replace us in that sense. Certainly not for any creative endeavor. And I think we're a long way away from what they call artificial general intelligence. And I think self-driving cars is probably a good example of this. We get close to having self-driving cars, but it's the last 2%, the last 2% of the last 2% that is the hardest bit. And until you're completely there, until you have a self-driving car which can navigate any street, any situation that even the most stupidest human can do, and do easily, and do when they're hungover, when they're tired, when they're having a row with their girlfriend or boyfriend, and still do it. I think we have a long way to go till we have to worry about our being taken over by AI.
There's a historian called George Dyson who, in his latest book called Analogia, gives exactly this example of Cantor's infinities.
Oh, right.
And he's, I think, putting forth the argument that we went from analog machines to digital.
Yeah.
And now these systems that we've built, like social networks and all the computing environment, is generating so much information and growing at such an enormous and rapid pace that they're kind of like seeding a new generation of analog mega computers. So he's talking about the current digital as kind of like the cradle for a new type of analog computer made out of the digital hardware, let's say, and then
right.
the connections between humans and something like a social network.
Right. Yes, a sort of computer is a synthesis of all that, and because it's sort of networked and some sort of emergent intelligence comes from that. Yes,
I don't think he's talking necessarily only about it going straight to the question of intelligence, but more of entities that have whims or something like the stock market. That we don't really understand what they're doing, and yet that they have some kind of agency.
Right. Yes. Absolutely. And I think even on the small scale that I've been working at, the fact that unexpected things have happened, really unexpected things, just shows how there's so much that we don't know, but is there to be discovered.
Do you ever get mystical about your work? Do you think that there's some life force present in that in your work, or?
I would say that there's life force present in the universe we live in, if you see what I mean. And so, with my work, all I can hope to do is sort of reflect on that, or comment on that in some way, and perhaps make people think about how the world is that they live in. But definitely, I think the world that we do live in is extraordinarily beautiful. I think we are so lucky to be in that world, and just such richness and amazing things. So I get really the work is me is a reflection in a way of that, and a journey of discovery, I think that's the sense of it.
Has your opinion about Silicon Valley and that whole scene changed since you were there, given the evolution of the world?
Yes and no. I mean, I've never been. I've never had any illusions, particularly about Silicon Valley. It is, of course, very technology focused, and although much of it grew out of the counterculture, I guess, which is an open-mindedness and willingness to look at the future, which I very much appreciate. I do feel that there is sometimes when things get really complicated, sometimes I feel the intuition gets lost. I think that's what I would say a problem I would have with Silicon Valley, or when things become too much about just following some rules in order to get to something. Like, to get through the door, you have to ask the wizard for a special rock and these kinds of things. And it's just like, no, that's we shouldn't have to live like that. I mean, the world, the natural world we live in, is a very intuitive place, and we can relate to it intuitively with feel and touch, and without having to turn into logic necessarily everything that we do. So I wouldn't want Silicon Valley to take over the whole world. I mean, it kind of is in some ways, but I don't think it's the whole future. So I think it's interesting because, for example, in architecture, in the 80s or thereabouts, when computers first sort of became available and on the scene, everyone was rushing to use computers to develop buildings and so forth. And so you have Frank Gehry did amazing things with parameterized design, these kinds of things. But and the schools of architecture were very focused on computers and using computers to draft buildings and so forth. But then I kind of realized that something was being lost in just going straight to the computer for developing designs. And in fact, it was a better way was sort of model making and sketching and using all these more intuitive, more softer tools. And that was actually the better way to get at the design of what you want to say. So, and then computers become a tool, not the tool that everything should be in. So I feel that understanding applies more generally, I think.
We've been trying to get at this topic, this theme of the fault of this discontinuity that we somehow feel in the world. How did you see the pandemic affecting these kinds of things in community and discourse and in understanding? How do you look at the world in 2021 right now as opposed to before the pandemic?
As opposed to in the before times, as they say, yes. Well, I suppose with any great shock to the system, and it's the whole system, it shakes things up, and it shines a light on how things are, and you can't, it's hard to hide from or run away from, and if for various societies or parts of societies or cultures or whatever, for everything really, it's under a challenge, and so you see the best of things and the worst of things. So you get a better understanding of how society works because it's not working, right? And how much we take for granted. Now, for me personally, what it's made me realize is how important human interaction is for working creatively. When you're not surrounded by other creative people or other people more generally, you tend to sort of slow down a bit. You've got no one to show what you're doing. You kind of got no one to talk about what you're doing. You can't see what other people are doing, and you feel a bit demotivated. And it kind of does put a dampener on things. Now, more generally, this I think, and I would hope, the failure in this situation has been what we might call the neoliberal project. This idea that if you just let people do whatever they want to do, then everything will be okay, right? And you can privatize everything, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and you don't need much of a state. And I think this situation has shown that that's not the case, that and particularly in times of stress and everything, actually there is such a thing as society and a community, and that we should think in those terms. So hopefully, if that's something we can bring out of this crisis, is that even though we have a self-organizing world, or rest of it, there's still a necessity for looking at things holistically, and understanding things as a whole, as opposed to just lots of things interacting together.
How do you feel about Lisbon nowadays in terms of your creation and just as a city in general to have a kind of creative experience?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I've missed it this last 18 months or so, because I live over the river in Almada, and of course there haven't been events. It's been difficult to see people, so I've been able to work remotely, but I haven't been able to engage with the cultural scene because there hasn't been a cultural scene. You know, everyone's had to hide is the wrong word, but there's many things that we haven't been able to do these last 18 months. And it's I was mentioned earlier on, it's been nice to come into Lisbon today. This is the first day for many months, and it's beautiful today. The weather is perfect. It's a nice, refreshing breeze, and Lisbon has never looked better than right now. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting back involved with things, seeing the events, the people, all these things. I think Lisbon is a great place. I think it has a great future for creative culture. I mean, it always has been a creative place. Portugal, of course, has a rich history of visual arts, all these things. And I'm glad that I'm here and hopefully can be a part of it in the future.
What are you most excited about in terms of your work and in terms of new projects? Sure.
Yes. So I'm interested. So there's some interactive projects that I want to now progress, because obviously at the moment I haven't been able to progress them. So I'm kind of interested in how you might record some movements, what people do, and then kind of play it back in a time-shifted way, or play around with that. And so there's many sort of motion capture technologies and that kind of thing going on. But one project that I'm particularly excited about, that I want to develop, is this idea of footprints. So if you take a surface, a sandy surface, a dusty surface, and you walk across it, now obviously you leave footprints. Now you could use a camera to notice the difference, and then play those footprints back sometime later. And so perhaps you can have people walking around during the day, and then at night you then play back the footprints they left behind, these kind of things. So it's kind of playing with time shifting, I suppose, and there's some other works that other people have been doing around that kind of thing. I think there's something like a mirror where you look at it and you don't see your reflection, you see someone else's reflection that they looked in previously. These kind of things, it's great. So that's one thing. I think I kind of trying to get away from the digital and trying to get more into the physical stuff. So instead of just images or projections, to look at creating almost like fabrics. This is a project that I had started working on before, but again, because I couldn't get into the workshops, kind of on pause. But sort of technological fabric. So you have this idea of some technology going on in the fabric which may have incorporate LEDs or sensors, these kind of things, which then work together as a network to have the fabric doing something a bit more than just sort of sitting at the end there. But fabrics is very challenging thing to be working with, or because the fabric does so much, or clothing does so much. It's three-dimensional to begin with. It obviously clothes the human body, which is a doubly curved surface, so technically there's big challenges there. And it has a social aspect to it and a protective aspect to it. So that's a very a challenging environment to try and do something in, to explore. But it's kind of nice because a fabric starts off as a flat sheet, right? So it kind of is a natural way to go from the imagery, the animations that are two-dimensional to fabric, and try and make something which is, so it's like half two-dimensional, half three-dimensional. It's a two-dimensional thing that becomes three-dimensional, and so that's interesting. So I think that's directions I'd like to go in.
Really cool. There's also kind of a link between textiles and the digital world with the looms and even in terms of...
Absolutely, yeah, exactly this. Yes, that's right. I think the first computers, in some sense, were looms, mechanical looms that you could program to make the tapestries of the fabrics that you're making. So yeah, such a rich background and a natural coming together of these things.
Are you concerned with or do you participate or do you see a role in your work for politics or activism of some kind? Because what you just described, you can also see on the other side as with the latest trends in wearables or smart clothing, or so there seems to be kind of a parallel history of technology, and the non-commercial version, let's call it, is at times very connected with activism and with empowerment and kind of a struggle against or in reaction to the surveillance capitalism, for example. These notions that technology doesn't allow us to kind of like have an autonomous
yes.
place. Are you concerned with this? Do you try and get involved in this kind of conversation?
I would say the short answer is no, actually. But perhaps unusually. I think that a lot of art now is quite political, and that's a good thing, and it should be. But maybe I think perhaps other people can perhaps do that a little better than I can. So, and I also think I kind of feel that we are more when we look beyond ourselves. So perhaps there's, in some areas, we've maybe been a little bit too self-absorbed or looking inwards. And I feel that if we look outwards to what could be, then that will bring us on more, perhaps, than getting upset about what is. So perhaps that so maybe my contribution to that kind of thing is maybe a bit more subtle, in the sense of trying to like open people's minds or take people away, or perhaps a little bit of escapism in some sense, but to open people's horizons a bit and make them think a bit about the natural world as something that has incredible power of itself. And that maybe makes our own political squabbles or whatever, puts them in a bit more context, perhaps. But I can't say that there's a strong political agenda in what I'm trying to do. But a philosophical agenda, though, I would say.